So we have CNN sounding the alarm, saying Russia's summer offensive is turning into an escalating crisis for Ukraine, especially in the Pokrovsk area. In addition to Western mainstream media reports, if you just read, mind you, your sanity might be damaged by reading such things. But if you just read what, let's say, Vladimir Zelensky says when he talks about, for example, conversations with Donald Trump, nowhere in here is there anything about the battlefield other than Russian attacks. So I think that says a lot about what's going on. But Scott, if you could give analysis, because I take it that a lot of the actions, behaviors, and reactions from Donald Trump's administration, Donald Trump, NATO have something to do with this.
Well, I mean, first of all, the what is the first casualty in war is truth, and look at Trump just throwing out made up numbers. Somehow the Russians lost 20,000 dead in a month. Ukraine has only suffered 8,000 dead since January. My understanding, based upon conversations with people who were at the front line and some other anecdotal information, is that the Russians are losing 150, 200 dead a week. That's a lot. I understand that 200 dead a week broke the back of the United States during the Vietnam War. So this is not a insignificant number. And, so we're looking at the Russians, dropping 600 to, 800 men a month. A lot. That's bigger than a battalion. But that ain't 20,000 a month. The Ukrainians are suffering, depending on where you're at. They're dropping on a daily basis close to 1,500, 2,000 guys, dead and wounded, a day. These are unsustainable numbers, and yet they can't tell the truth, so they flip the script. And it's it's the Ukrainians that are losing guys that they in numbers they can't replace. And what's happened here is that the Ukrainians are actually at a juncture right now where they don't have enough troops left to even with the recruitment they're doing. And just so everybody knows, not everybody who gets sent to the front line is getting popped on the head. The vast majority of Ukrainian troops that are being mobilized are being mobilized in a normal fashion. They show up, they get processed, they get trained, and they get to the front lines. But the Ukrainians don't generate enough forces to replace the casualties. And so every day that goes by, they're getting weaker. This isn't just me in my analysis saying, this is a Ukrainian parliamentarian announcing this on the floor of the Rada, saying, you guys got to be real here. We can't replace our losses. We get weaker every day. The Russians, on the other hand, get stronger every day because, yes, they're suffering losses, but they're recruiting far more people. It's not even, and so not only are they replacing the losses at the battlefield, but they're beginning to assemble, viable reserves, hundreds of thousands of men, which give them great flexibility when the time comes. But this allows Russia to maintain pressure. Ukrainians are very capable soldiers. They're better than anything NATO's got going right now. Even the United States Army couldn't do what Ukraine's doing on the battlefield. Couldn't survive the way Ukraine's surviving. I'm sorry, U.S. Army. That's just a statement of truth. They're battle hardened. They have sound small unit leadership, and it's certain areas when they have good middle management and senior leadership, they can stop the Russians from advancing. And given the right equipment, they can launch counterattacks to push the Russians back. Guys, that's not the end of the world. You have studied military history. You do know that even when the United States was beating the Nazis in April of 1945, if you read the unit diaries, 1st Battalion, 460 Infantry made an assault in here, but were counterattacked by the Germans and forced to fall back a kilometer and a half. Yeah, that's war. Read about the Russian advance on Berlin. The Germans are counterattacking up until the last moment. And when you counterattack and you pick the right time and place, you can push the enemy back. So the Ukrainians have the ability to stop the Russian advance in certain areas and launch counterattacks to push the Russians back. But they can't do that because in order to assemble those forces, they have to rob Peter to pay Paul. And we're at the point right now where if the Russians in the vicinity of Pokrovsk, the Russians stopped doing the frontal assault because the Ukrainians brought in troops. But where the Ukrainians brought in the troops, there's no troops to replace. They have to thin it out. And then the Russians just simply shift over, begin to advance. This is what's happening. They're creating an encirclement by advancing on the flanks. I think the left flank, the southern flank, is sort of stopped right now. And so now they're making all the progress here. If the Ukrainians shift their forces up north, then the south will make it. And then when they shift to both, cover both wings, the center will advance. It's just the way it works. And it's happening all up and down the front line. The Ukrainians pulled some people out of the Zaporizhia area to come up and reinforce. The Russians started advancing to Zaporizhia. Can't stop them. We need to stop them in Sumy. So we pull people out of the Kupiansk area. But now the Russians are moving on Kupiansk. Wherever they pull people out to plug a hole, the Russians advance. That's the advantage that they have. And they're advancing at a greater rate of advance than they have at any time. The Russians still aren't doing the full up, big arrow stuff. The Russian attacks, I think I've described this before. I'll just go through one more time. This is explained to me by an officer in Abdi Alidanov's Akhmat Special Forces. He talked about mastering the 3s and the 6s. Because, Larry, you know this, when I went through, I did, fire team rushes as part of a squad advance, as part of a platoon advance, as part of a company advance. A fire team is 5 Marines, and we're doing fire team advances. That means one fire team rushes up, squad commanders controlling it, platoon commanders controlling it. You do that today, you get killed. Yeah. The Russians today, their assault group is 3 men. That's it, 3 men. They're supported by drones and everything. They got a drone overhead. They got artillery coming in. They got a drone team. There's a lot more Russians behind the scenes with the drones, bringing the drones in. But the assault team is 3 men. That's the 3s. And they will assault the position that they're on, generally defended by between 7 and 12 Ukrainians. And they kill them or they wound them and they take them prisoner. And as soon as that assault team can fail. They get killed. They withdraw. All right, you lost 3 guys. But generally speaking, the assault team will take the position, and then the 6s come in. The 6s are the men that rush forward to consolidate that position. Now you get 9 guys on target. You dig in, and you wait until the next assault. But that's what we're doing. We're talking about 3-man assault teams all up and down the field, assaulting a position, supported by drones and fire support. When things go south, you lose 3 guys. The reason why I want to emphasize this point is, do you know how many defeats the Russian would have to, have doing 3s and 6s to lose 20,000 guys a month? Okay, I'm just a simple Marine.
I can't do that.
Doing the math on that one. This is why I believe people who are fighting that say. I will also say this: the Russian wounded, and your number of wounded is generally reflective of your casualty rate on the battlefield. Although speaking to Mariet Karelin, he says there's days that go by where the Russians don't lose a single guy dead. They lose wounded, but nobody's dying. But the wounded used to be are evacuated to medical facilities in the rear. Back in 2022, 2023, these facilities work in overtime. I mean, the just wounded were just flown back. Today, they're there, but the numbers have dropped way down. So that's anecdotal evidence that you're just not getting the flow through of casualties to be reflective of a 20,000 dead. Because if you're talking about 20,000 dead, you're talking about 60 to 80,000 wounded. That means the Russians losing 100,000 guys a month in terms of casualties, and a total force structure of 700 to 800,000. It's insane numbers. Why the president is speaking these numbers is beyond me. Why people allow him to say these numbers, because it just discredits him, discredits his credibility, discredits his team. it means nobody takes you seriously, because if you're that far removed from reality, the reason why I'm going through these details, guys, so your audience understands there's no way in hell that these numbers are accurate. They're not. There's nothing out there to sustain them. The evidence is exactly the opposite. This is why, I mean, people are like, Scott, you're so pro-Russian. You got your nose up Abdiel Adonov's ass. Yeah, because he's a frontline commander, and I learn a hell of a lot. And then I talk to other people too, talk to the drone operators, talk to the guys who provide the logistics resupply, talk to guys who affiliate with the special forces and what they're doing. And you get all the information. Yes, it could be, slanted and not the whole story, but when you get it all and you average it out and you compare and contrast, start matching the numbers, the picture that shows up is that the Russians are advancing across the entire length. There's nothing the Ukrainians can do to stop it. The Ukrainians don't have enough troops to, plug the holes, let alone build a reserve capability. And the Russians, they keep saying the Russian summer offensive. I don't know, Danny, Larry, I checked the calendar. We're sort of like midway through August. Summer's here, guys. So it proves that we're not talking about calendar-driven events. I mean, the Russians aren't about looking at a calendar. Larry and I have made the same mistake, and I'm with Larry. I'm done pulling out the crystal ball. When the Russians win is up to the Russians.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say they're winning because, again, Larry's probably from the same school that I am, hyper aggressive. I don't understand 3s and 6s and drones. I don't. I mean, I'm beginning to. I'm starting to learn. But I'm about pushing the assault forward, consolidating, and continuing to exploit victory until you can't exploit anymore. As long as the enemy's retreating, you advance. And that's just the way the Marine Corps taught me. This is why we took Kuwait City in 3 days when Norman Schwarzkopf thought we never could take it, because we don't quit. We just keep going. We keep going. Keep going. Well, that's not what the Russians are doing. They're doing something different. They're doing the attritional warfare thing, where 3 assault soldiers are taking out 12 Ukrainians. And they're winning. They're prevailing. And they understand that this conflict isn't just about the battlefield. It's about the economy, which is not going well for the Ukrainians. It's about politics. It ain't going. Did you see the SVR's press release the other day, Larry? We're about the secret meeting in Switzerland. I don't know if it's true, but what it did is it built upon things that we know are happening. We know Zelensky's meeting with the Swiss president. We know that Yermak meets with the national security advisor. We know the Ukrainians have had meetings with the United States and the United Kingdom. We know Zelensky has positioned himself to repeat. So the Russians have put together a report that totally undermines the credibility of the Ukrainian government. So you have this one dictatorial president, Zelensky, that everybody says has to go. And we have to preserve Ukrainian democracy. And we preserve Ukrainian democracy by handpicking Zelensky, who is a Banderas Nazi, by the way, and bypassing the electoral process. This creates instability, political instability inside Ukraine. So you have economic chaos, political instability, and military disaster. And the combined effect is designed to collapse Ukraine as a functioning nation state. That'll happen, I believe, inevitably, but it'll happen on a timetable dictated by Russia, and it's not predicated upon what we in the West want to happen on a given calendar date.
What Scott was saying about the battlefield in this article that does mention the summer offensive, which is well underway. They do report the things that somewhat, not in as great detail as Scott, but for example, in the Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk area, they just talk about the swift change and control of territory and the importance of drones in that. But Larry, your assessment of the battlefield situation.
Well, anybody who's listening, because I want to help you understand the revolution that's taken place in warfare that we're witnessing on the battlefield in Ukraine. Go out in front of your house, pretend that you're carrying an automatic weapon. Pretend or imagine that you're now going into an area that's occupied by an enemy. And you've got to figure out where they are. And if they're in an entrenched position, that they more likely are going to be protected if you try to shoot at them. So figure out, how are you going to move up that street? And that was sort of the situation even the Russians were in 3 years ago. But here's what the situation is now. You're that person. So you get you detect an area where you think the firing is coming from. So you get a drone in the air that's able to surveil and tell you who is exactly in what position. Are they hiding behind the house? Are they out behind the tool shed? Are they over to the left? Or are they over to the right? Then, instead of having to call in artillery, you can call in a drone which functions like the most precise artillery in the world because it carries a charge that can specifically hit, go through a window, go through a door. And what we're talking about is that soldier now is in instant communication with the drone operators and with the commanders. Now, I'm sure Scott has been through some field exercises where in the old days where you're carrying like a Prick 77 radio, which, weighed a ton, and then you had to have batteries to keep that thing up. So all of a sudden there's an entirely new logistics trail that gets added on to this modern effort. But what the Russians have achieved is a full integration. The Marine Corps, and I'll brag for Scott at this point, since I was trained by a Marine colonel. The Marine Corps was different from the Army in particular because Marine officers growing up were trained to do combined arms. So they were trained that they could call in airstrikes. They were trained to call in artillery strikes. They were trained to be able to bring in naval gunfire. They weren't just limited to one option. They had a broad range. The Russians have taken that and now have it on steroids. And they are literally writing the book on the transition to modern warfare with a whole variety of drones that are both FPVs as well as drones which are for observation and intelligence collection. And they've been doing this on the fly. They're making it up as they go along, but it tells us something else about the nature of the Russian army. It is adaptable. It's not locked in as many Western military analysts have wrongly believed to old practices and bureaucratic structures and rigid hierarchies. No. These folks they're testing stuff on the battlefield, and if it doesn't work, they're able to go up the chain of command and say, "This is bullshit. This doesn't work. We're not going to keep doing that. This is how it works." And as Scott noted, they're in no rush. They're not on a clock. This is not like a football game where you're in the fourth quarter and you've got 2 minutes left. They got plenty of time. And I had asked General Brzezinski, a retired general, when I was in Moscow in March, and asked him specifically the question: Why hasn't the general staff ordered all the bridges across the Dnieper to be taken out to cut off the line of communications? And he laughed and he goes, "I've been asking that myself." But then as we got into it, it appears that part of the general staff strategy was if they shut down those lines of communication across the river, and then there was no way to start resupplying what army or military presence of Ukraine was left on the east side, that it would not have attrited the NATO capabilities as well that were embedded. And the goal is to attrit, not just Ukraine, but attrit NATO. And as we now look back over the last 3.5 years, it's turned out to be a damn effective strategy.
Is the military woes on the battlefield of Ukraine, and of course their backers, does this explain why we see not just Donald Trump, but the entirety, Europe, etc., or the entire collective West are 100% in on relying on sanctions, which we've heard over the last several years were the most effective weapon? This is Donald Trump's promise for more sanctions.
They seem to be pretty good at avoiding sanctions. They're wily characters, and they're pretty good at avoiding sanctions. So we'll see what happens. But Steve is focused right now on.
So in the beginning, just to clarify, he said that there will be more sanctions, but we don't have to actually move into that. But because I can show you this before your comments, Lindsey Graham, these sanctions, these tariffs, both of them are going so far that now they're targeting India. So India is supposed to be a strategic cog for the United States against China. But now India is being targeted for its oil trade with Russia. And Lindsey Graham, who some have surmised is a huge part of Donald Trump's foreign policy making, was very appreciative when Donald Trump talked about how there's going to be massive tariffs for India, not only buying massive amounts of Russian oil and then selling on the market. They don't care how many people are being killed in Ukraine. And because of this, tariffs are going to be substantially raised. So, Scott, how do you see that? What do you make of my assessment that it seems that sanctions, tariffs, these things seem to be attempting to make up for the lack of success in the most important realm, at least from the standpoint of how this all began, with the hope that Russia would fall?
Well, I've always said that the sanctions aren't a policy. Sanctions are what happens in the absence of policy, meaning that when you don't know what to do, sanction. And what the United States has done with this is that we've turned this act of impotence into a long-term strategy of destabilization. And so that was just the approach we took with Saddam Hussein, where we slapped sanctions on and just kept them on until which time we were able to, bring about the collapse. This was the Syrian strategy. And it's a strategy that we're trying to apply against Russia. But as the president has said, Russia are wily characters. And, it's not going to it's not going to work. But I think what you're seeing with everybody jumping on the sanction bandwagon is that we just don't have any other viable alternatives. But they don't understand that we are unable to implement the sanctions that we seek. China's told us to pound sand. India has told us to pound sand. Brazil has told us to pound sand. Basically, everybody in regards to this has told us to pound sand. These sanctions are going to have no impact. I'm sort of curious to see what the president is going to do on Friday. But, he may be escalating us towards a major economic confrontation with the world, with BRICS. He thinks that this is going to destroy BRICS. I personally believe that this is going to solidify BRICS and be the glue that brings BRICS together. This is bad policy, but it's because we don't have a policy. We don't have a Russian policy. We don't know what we want to accomplish. It's nonsensical what we say about Ukraine and what our goals and objectives are. We don't have a NATO policy because we can't afford what he says. I'll leave it at the president right now is bragging about $600 billion that the EU has promised him to invest in America. I get to invest wherever I want. It doesn't exist, Mr. President. Ursula von der Leyen admitted that she doesn't have any control. There's no $600 billion. There's nobody lining up to give you that money. The $720 billion that of energy purchases over the course of 3 years, it's a made up number. It can't happen. I mean, I think Europe bought $76 billion total per year last year. How do you get that to be now $250 billion a year? The United States only produces $310 billion worth of energy, and we're not going to suddenly reallocate that all to Europe. Europe couldn't receive $250 billion worth of U.S. energy because it's LNG. That's liquid natural gas. You have to have a place to receive it. You have to offload it. You have to have the degas or deliquefying facilities. Europe doesn't have that infrastructure. It's a totally made up number. Everything this president does is a totally made up concept. And right now we simply don't have any way to leverage or to put pressure on Russia other than the threat of sanctions. But as the president said, Russia is not going to blink at all, and neither are the nations that are working with Russia.
What's your assessment of this seemingly just absolute reliance on sanctions as the primary weapon now, as the battlefield becomes just stagnant for the United States and the collective West, untenable?
24 years ago, in the year 2000, the United States was the major trading partner of 75% of the world. So if you did a global map of it, most of the world would associate blue with the United States. 75% of the world was blue. Today, when you ask that question, which country is the major trading partner of the majority of nations? It's like 80% now are majority trading partners with China. China and the United States have completely flipped roles. Sanctions and tariffs can be powerful tools if you're in the position the United States was 24 years ago, but not today. If you're the only supplier of rare earth minerals, then if I decide to sanction those, put a sanction on those so that I'm not going to ship them to people outside that need it, those countries outside are going to be in trouble. Likewise, if you, the United States, are putting sanctions on me, China, and because of that, China says, okay, screw you. I'm not sending you any more rare earth minerals or magnets, which you absolutely need, or pharmaceuticals. Now, all of a sudden, the power arithmetic is changed. It's the United States is vulnerable, not China. And so Trump is living in a world that doesn't exist anymore economically. He thinks it's still 2000. He thinks the United States is still being able to call the shots. So look at what happened with, we told Brazil, okay, we're not going to sanction orange juice because, if we sanction orange juice and the tariffs on that go up, we're going to have a lot of pissed off people who drink orange juice. But we are going to tariff your coffee. And what did the Brazilians do? They didn't go, oh my God, we've lost, the United States are the only people in the world who drink coffee. They went, no, okay. They just signed a new deal with China. You know what? There are a lot more coffee, even though they drink tea in China, still a lot more coffee drinkers in terms of total numbers than in the United States. How about pork, soybeans? The Chinese actually at the start of tariffs, man, they bought a lot of soybeans out of the United States, just piled up because they got it in store. But now that the tariffs are kicking in, they're buying from Brazil and from Russia. So the point is, if you impose sanctions work if you have monopoly control. Tariffs work if you got monopoly control. But if you're living in a competitive world where you're not the sole source, and in fact, you're just one of another group of guys or countries, then it is a counterproductive, damaging strategy.
Yeah, and I just pulled up that reference mainstream media reporting on what you're saying, Larry, regarding Brazilian coffee. And if you go to China, you know how big of a deal this is because Chinese domestic brands for coffee are very important and popular. So the fact that China is willing to open up their market just goes to show how far all of these countries are willing to go to counter the tariffs, counter sanctions. It's definitely a losing gambit.
Yeah,
gentlemen, anything else you'd like to say? Oh, Larry, please.
I was just going to say, the U.S. is going to discover it's no longer relevant, and that's the problem. We think we are.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to say, Scott, before we conclude here?
I'm just going to double down on what Larry said. And this is horrible as an American, but we're no longer the exceptional nation, or what was the other term that was used? The indispensable nation. We're the irrelevant nation. We simply don't matter. The coffee thing is a perfect example. China is 1.2 billion people, more maybe. The scope and scale of their markets dwarfs anything we have going, and China is fully capable of adapting. And when the world adapts, because the world economy has been expanding. When the world finally realizes that they can live without America, that there's nothing America produces that the world needs, and the American consumer can be eliminated. I mean, because that's the thing that we consume. Well, other people consume too, like the Chinese drinking coffee. They will find solutions to everything we do. And one of these days we're going to wake up to where we're alone. We can't even call up a help center anymore because we'll have sanctioned India to the point where they'll shut down all the kind of people that help me navigate through my Verizon billing plan. So it's over for the United States. We have become the irrelevant nation. And then what do? Have a temper tantrum, threaten everybody with nuclear weapons? I mean, it's that crazy.